A soldier is hacked to death in Britain's capital. One of the suspects says it was because British soldiers kill Muslims every day. But is Britain's Prime Minister right to call it terrorism? And how will this play into concerns about a rise in Islamophobia in the UK? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. A British soldier has been singled out for what's said to be a revenge attack against the government's foreign policy. Witnesses say he was run down by a car and then attacked and stabbed to death right in front of passers-by in the London suburb of Woolwich. He'd been wearing a T-shirt with the army charity Help for Heroes logo on it. Well, the two suspects were later shot as they charged at police and placed under armed guard in hospital. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron reacted quickly, saying Britain would not give in to violent extremism and terror. Well, two mosques were later set on fire elsewhere in Britain, fueling concerns of a backlash against Muslims. One of the Woolwich suspects appeared to try to justify what they'd done. He said, "We must fight them as they fight us, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I apologize that women had to witness this today, but in our land, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your government. They don't care about you." Now, Prime Minister Cameron and London's Mayor Boris Johnson gave this reaction after a hastily convened emergency meeting.
First, this country will be absolutely resolute in its stand against violent extremism and terror. We will never give in to terror or terrorism in any of its forms. Second, this view is shared by every community in our country. This was not just an attack on Britain and on the British way of life. It was also a betrayal of Islam and of the Muslim communities who give so much to our country.
It is completely wrong to blame this killing on the religion of Islam, but it is also equally wrong to try to draw any link between this murder and British foreign policy or the actions of British forces who are risking their lives abroad for the sake of freedom. The fault lies wholly and exclusively in the warped and deluded mindset of the people who did it.
I'll be bringing in our panel of guests in just a moment, but first I'm joined by Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, Britain's first ever Minister for Faith and Communities, who was with David Cameron in Thursday's emergency meeting. Baroness Warsi, good to have you with us on Inside Story. If you can just give us some insight into what was discussed at the COBRA meeting you were attending.
Well, the COBRA meeting is convened whenever there is a situation such as the one that's arisen over the last 24 hours. It was an opportunity for different parts of government to update the Prime Minister and then also to set the priorities going forward. And I think the statement that some of which you've just played from the Prime Minister came out after that meeting.
Okay, I'll be talking to you about the priorities in just a moment, but first let me ask you this, because right after the attack, British politicians as well as the media in Britain came out and characterized this attack as terrorism. What constitutes a terrorist attack? Is this a terrorist attack?
Well, clearly, if you look at the way in which this barbaric act was committed, if you look at what they said their intention was, and if you look at the way in which these two individuals then wanted to be filmed and photographed and wanted to terrorize people through the media, there is no doubt that this was a terrorist attack. It was an opportunity they felt to try and scare people, to try and intimidate people, and to try and divide people. But I think what has been heartening over the last 24 hours is the way in which community after community, religious communities and those of no faith, and specifically the British Muslim communities, have spoken out with a unified single voice, unreservedly condemning these barbaric acts and saying that this is not done in their name and in the name of their faith.
And there is a suggestion, Baroness Warsi, from British media, such as one newspaper, for example, The Telegraph, and I'm quoting here, the headline was, "The Woolwich beheading is straight out of Al-Qaeda's terror manual." How do you respond to such inflammatory comments, some might say?
Well, it's for the media to decide how responsible it's going to be in the language that it uses, but it's for us as politicians to decide to be responsible in the language that we use. And I think it's very clear from the language and the statement that was given by the Prime Minister how the statement that he gave under very difficult circumstances was measured. He showed strong leadership, and he clearly said what is in the minds of most Britons at the moment, that we need to stand united against terrorists and extremists who seek to divide us.
A horrific act. You're absolutely right, Baroness Worsley, but let me put this to you. Some people are also questioning and saying, what about the United Kingdom and the United States, who have killed Muslims for many years, in fact, and say that this is not terrorism? Your response?
You know, I have a role at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I'm a minister at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and we regularly discuss this concept of identity politics when we talk about freedom of religion and belief. And traditionally, when we discuss freedom of religion and belief, it's always been the West, seen as the West talking about minority Christians, and it's always been seen as the East talking about minority Muslims. And I don't see those divisions in the same way. I do not feel that people are divided along those lines. We have an incredibly diverse and plural society in the United Kingdom. We have many, many Muslims who serve in the armed forces. We have many people like me who have whose family have half a generation of history in the United Kingdom, but whose grandfathers both served in the British Army long before my parents even came to these shores. I think those divisions of East and West and Muslim and non-Muslim world are not the true picture, and I think it's inappropriate in these circumstances to make such references. All
right, well, let's just go back to the framing of this particular event. Now, as we know, the framing and labeling can have significant implications on policy. So can you tell us about what was discussed at that COBRA meeting that could shape security going forward in the UK?
Well, it would be wrong for me to discuss the details of a COBRA meeting. Of course, those are confidential meetings. But what I can assure you of is that the police and the security services are doing their job. The politicians are doing their job. The communities are stepping up to the mark. And what we're finding, interestingly, is that at the end of these very tragic circumstances, we are seeing a nation which is wanting to move towards a position where we show a very clearly united front. And I think positive, I hope, will come out of this, that where attempts are made to divide us amongst religious lines or racial lines in this country, that communities of all backgrounds will stand together and say, no, we all have a stake in this society and we all have a responsibility towards this country, and we will stand together when we're faced with these kinds of attacks.
But having said that, Baroness, you've also said that there are rising levels of hate crimes targeting Muslims in the UK. How concerned are you that this attack is going to unleash a backlash? And what are authorities, as well as what should authorities as well as community leaders be doing right now?
I think the challenges that you have with extremism is that whether they are done in the name of religion or whether it's done in the name of nationalism, they feed off each other. Extremists rely upon the other to be so extreme so that they can justify their conduct. And we've seen extremist conduct by the English Defence League too over the last 24 hours. And of course there is a concern that people will use the tragic circumstances like this to use the opportunity to divide communities. But I think when the Prime Minister spoke this morning, he was speaking about extremists of all sorts and sending a message to all people who wish to divide us in this country that we will not tolerate such conduct. Yes, there have been a number of threats and a number of attacks. The police have dealt with those swiftly. A number of arrests have been made, and those perpetrators will be brought to court and will be brought to justice. I, of course, have raised more generally the issue of concern that I have about the way in which Muslim communities are seen. I think it is right for me to challenge my country to say that we can make relationships better. It is right that every community in every country should feel that they are protected. But having raised those concerns very vocally and at the heart of government, I can also say very loudly and very proudly that Britain is one of the best nations in the world to live in as a Muslim, as a British Muslim.
Okay, Baroness Worsley, thank you very much. Appreciate your time with us on Inside Story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get to our guests. We have in London Steve Park, a terrorism and security expert. In Birmingham, Keith Vaz, British Labour MP and chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee. And also joining us from London, Shiraz Maher. He's the head of outreach at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College in London. Good to have you with us, gentlemen, on Inside Stories. Shiraz, if I can come over to you first, and just looking at this attack in Woolwich that took place, are you surprised by the brazenness of the attack? The attackers wanted the whole thing filmed and to get it out there to the world.
Well, I think what we can see from this attack is that it was a very ideological attack, insofar as the men involved attacked symbols of the state. They attacked a soldier, but then didn't threaten any of the passers-by or bystanders. They really let them get on with their business and waited there until the police arrived. And then once the police arrived, they attacked them. So it's clear to me that this was an ideological attack with a very clear political message that wanted to target elements of the state that they felt aggrieved with.
Steve, what do you think of that idea that it was an ideological attack? And also to you, did it look like they had the support of a larger group, British media suggesting an Al-Qaeda style support, or were they just two guys operating alone?
I think that's difficult to say at the moment. I think we'll stick at two guys operating alone until enough evidence comes out. However, it did seem as though it was premeditated. They had planned this sort of sacrificial type of attack, and obviously they stayed at the scene. They had no, in terms of fleeing, they weren't going anywhere. You know, was it a sleeper cell? Have the borders of Britain been breached by a sleeper cell? We don't know. This would normally be a group of people that would be unknown even to the terrorist group, being ordered to do one thing and then simply disappearing. So yet again we're seeing this sort of what we consider to be this sort of disenfranchised kind of act, similar to what we saw in the Boston bombings. Obviously it's a completely different kind of travesty, but nevertheless it has the same impact and the same effect. It will have a big effect on Cobra. The Cabinet Office meeting that's been going on by Cobra, who are going to be looking at it, is to say, have Britain's borders been breached by a cell, and where is that going to lead us at this present time?
Keith, what's your take on the attack, and whether it was two men operating alone or if it was part of a wider organization?
Well, this is a horrific, barbaric attack that has taken place on the streets of London. And as both our other contributors have made clear, we don't have the full facts. I'm very interested in what they've been saying, and I think what they have been saying is going to be very helpful when we analyse precisely why they did this, why they behaved in this extraordinary way, because this particular barbaric attack is something completely out of the ordinary. You read about this in terms of fiction. You hear about people making threats to do the kinds of things that they've been doing, but I don't think that I had ever expected, and the British people ever expected, that on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of central London you could have this kind of attack. I think what we do need to do, however, is we need to answer, firstly, why this happened, and of course you have to take into consideration, as Shiraz has said, some of the comments that have been made directly by those responsible to people holding a mobile phone and therefore being recording what they were saying. This is brazen because they were very clear in their view why they did things.
All right,
but
well,
also,
since all the facts, as you're saying, Keith, have not been established, if all the facts have not been established, and they haven't, as you're saying, then is the term terrorism applicable to this attack at this particular point?
Well, the Prime Minister has used that term, and therefore he is in possession of more information than any of us on this programme, because he would have been briefed by the head of MI5, Andrew Parker, by the Commissioner, Bernard Hogan-Howe, by other experts at a meeting of Cobra and before and since, and if he uses that term he must have information that is not in the public domain. But of course there are different ways in which terrorism operates. There's the terrorism, as we've just heard from Steve, of what happened in Boston, and there's the terrorism, the acts that have taken place in other parts of the world. I think that he's used that word for a reason, and none of us know why he's used that word. He's been briefed, he's got the facts, but I think it is important at the end of the day, and this may even not be the time to do this, once all the facts have been amassed, to find out exactly why they did it, whether this was coordinated or whether these were people acting alone. Frankly, it would be wrong for us to prejudge a situation and for the story to run ahead of facts, because we don't have the full facts. But he
right, but okay, let me ask Shiraz then. Let me ask Shiraz, is the situation, Shiraz, being prejudged by using the word terrorism?
No, I don't think so. I think the men involved made it pretty clear in terms of the interview that was given almost immediately after the attack took place. The man made a very clear political statement calling for the overthrow of the government. He said that the governments don't care about us, as in the British people, and therefore we should overthrow the government. He also made reference to our lands, which is, at least from what we can deduce, a reference to Muslim countries where he presumably feels there are atrocities taking place. So all of that seems to fit into the pattern of the kind of rhetoric and discourse we've seen from Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists in the past. So I don't think we're prejudging anything or jumping the gun to say this is an act of terrorism. It's pretty clear, to my mind at least, from what we're seeing so far, that this is a terrorist act. And we should bear in mind, terrorism doesn't have to be of the kind or of the scale that we saw on 7/7 or 9/11. There are different kinds of attacks and different types of outcomes that terrorists seek to achieve, and it's not always mass casualty terrorism or simultaneous attacks of the kind we've become accustomed to, which have become synonymous with Al-Qaeda's operations in the West over the last decade.
Okay, well, Steve, I'll be coming to you in just a moment, but let me just stay with Shiraz here, because I'll put to you the same question I put to the Baroness a few moments ago, where some people are saying, in fact, the UK as well as the US commit terrorism themselves when they go into Muslim countries and kill Muslim civilians. What's your remark to that?
Well, I think it's an outrageous comparison and moral equivalence to draw a line between the activities of the West and Muslim countries and the hacking to death of a British serviceman on a London street in the middle of the day. I don't think you can draw a comparison between the two. It's an outrageous suggestion. This was clearly a terrorist act, and it doesn't have a place in a modern civilized society at all.
Steve, your comments.
I think what Keith said, effectively, I totally agree with, and the last speaker. I don't think it has a moral purpose to serve in comparing it. I've seen many real-life atrocities firsthand in many countries that I'm not going to start naming. However, I've seen those atrocities happen in front of me, and it becomes fairly commonplace, and therefore there's a mindset. The fact that it's happened on British soil, this is why I said to you, I think it's probably, without prejudging it, to be sacrificed. I would think it's got to be linked in some way to some sort of terrorist ideology, whether they're jihadists, and the only thing that confuses me here is the fact that a cell would act in a slightly different way. So that's why I brought on the term disenfranchised. Are they people that have been asked to do this for some of their issue? We do know that when the UK is attacked, as we would call that an attack last night, against Britain, then it shocks us all. All of a sudden we've got 1,200 extra policemen on duty in London. All of a sudden the barracks have got additional security. But there stands by that if somebody wants to do this kind of act, they can. It's not impossible, and I think it sends a shot across the arm to say, you know, should we have tighter security at our military installations? After all, these are the guys that are putting themselves on the front line in order to protect us, but outside our own country. Therefore, if we can be attacked like this once, we can be attacked like this again. There's been many famous statements about how possibly vulnerable we really could be when the tide turns and if the tide turns.
Right, and on that point, Steve, you've mentioned the Boston bombings. I mean, for attackers who commit acts such as these, and when they look at what happened in Boston and in other instances with the massive coverage that they can get, do you think that that encourages them to commit such attacks?
This is audacious by nature. It takes a very brave person and somebody who completely believes in another ideology, and the ideology is radicalism. Whether it's terrorism, that remains to be seen, because for us to prove that, we need to be able to speak to the people, and that's why perhaps having the Boston bombers and understanding eventually what their ideology was, it will benefit understanding the bigger picture, especially when it feels very similar. I know the event, as I said, is very different, but it feels very similar. The way the story came out last night, you know, we've got two people on the street who are not they don't care that they've, you know, effectively killed somebody, slain somebody in such barbaric terms, the kind of things that I've seen on streets in other countries. That sends a completely different message to me in terms of who we may be dealing with. Then we have the story that, you know, we have them on suspect watch lists. Well, what are we doing with that watch list? Are we actually watching them, or have we got the resources to watch them on our own borders? Because often as not, that can be the fundamental issue about having people in this country. I believe, I don't know for sure, that they had English passports. Therefore, you know, are we going back to 21/7 and we're missing vital clues? One imagines, because the intelligence services have been bolstered up to the degree that they have at the moment, then we've got more resources on the ground. We understand better, but it always makes me wonder, when things happen like this, have we really got our eye on the ball? It's concerning, it's worrying. You know, when a British service person, you know, has no defence, they are simply walking along the street, the total unexpected happens, and you know, this being the end result, which couldn't be any worse.
Keith, what do you make of what Steve is saying, and is this in a way a failure on the part of the UK intelligence services?
I think what's really important is that we should get the full facts. We can only do this, of course, after the event. And essential to that will be the question of whether or not these two individuals were known to the security services, whether they were on the radar, and whether they were being followed or monitored in some way. We then need to look at the entire response, but we can't really do that yet, because at the moment we don't have sufficient information other than what they have said. Both Shiraz and Steve are expert in this. They can put this within a pattern. Frankly, it's completely outside the box as far as I'm concerned. It's a shocking event. I think the people of London are shocked. What they want to know, first of all, is, are they safe? Is this an isolated incident? Is it being contained? And secondly, what further action can be taken to throw light on who these people are and why they have done this?
Shiraz, there's been revenge attacks on two mosques, we're hearing, after this attack that happened in Woolwich. Is it very concerning now, the attacks on anti-Muslim, or a rise in anti-Muslim sentiment in the UK?
Well, we've seen over the last few years the rise of this so-called counter-jihad movement, which in real truth is an anti-Muslim movement. It wants to stop Muslim immigration into Europe. It wants Muslims to leave Europe. It wants to end Muslim life in Europe. So, unfortunately, it is an extreme counter-reaction to a lot of the activity of jihadists and Muslim extremists that we've seen. And unfortunately, what you're finding now is a pattern of reciprocal radicalization, where one group does something to agitate the other, and then that group reacts, and this process goes around in a cyclical fashion. Now, that is extremely dangerous, because on the one hand, what you have is an increasing polarization of the debate and a polarization of views, and that makes nuance and intelligent debate and discussion much harder. And of course, what it also means is that for the vast majority of decent, normal people in the middle, we get caught up in the crossfire of the hatred of these two different and disparate groups. So this is a very dangerous and new development, and it's something I think the Prime Minister and the government are really going to have to look at very closely in the coming days and weeks.
All right. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you to my guests, Steve Park, thank you very much, Keith Vaz and Shiraz Maher. Thanks for joining us. And thanks to Baroness Worsey, who was joining us a little earlier on. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. You can follow the links for programs and click on Inside Story. You can also leave us your comments there as well. From me and the whole team, goodbye for now.